Hey folks! This one's for the Metroidvania and co-op fans, since those fine chaps at Game Critics were kind enough to shoot me a review copy of Studio Avantaj Prim's Anima Flux. I am pretty sure I pronounced that correctly, but don't hold me to that. Anyways, it's a title which seemed weirdly nostalgic, but did it make an impression for the Aeons, or was any fondness for it also left in flux? I'm your host Arlian. Let's find out together. And in the far-flung future, humanity created the Space Ark, a sprawling construct which serves as mankind's great bastion, a symbol of their perseverance, albeit one controlled by a theocratic regime which has endured for countless generations, and which remains besieged by a seemingly endless onslaught of mutants which proliferate at the fringe of society with the same rate as feral rats. The city's only bulwark is Nox, a shadowy military organization which keeps both the creatures outside and the citizens inside in check. So, sort of like the CIA, I guess. However, recently, an experiment has broken free from a secret research facility, sowing chaos in its wake and providing the perfect opening for all hell to break loose in the city. Except now the bulk of Nox's forces are being relegated to stemming the tide, so now the city's only hope is a pair of covert operatives tasked with tracking down and exterminating the creature. And perhaps along the way they may discover some of the city's secrets. So yeah, as far as both the premise and execution goes, I do think it's solid. The overall setting of the city is uncomfortably dystopian in a way that might feel a little bit familiar, and does a decent enough job establishing that tone fairly early on, such as the shady and Machiavellian nature of your employer and the discomfort of the common citizens. That said, what really got my interest was the bits of weirdness native to the setting, some of which is baked in the surreal visions/hallucinations that the pair occasionally encounter. It does a decent job of raising a lot of questions as you progress forward, and some of these even have answers that can be uncovered, albeit only if you're willing to engage in a bit of legwork. I say this because there's a whole bunch of collectible background lore you can unearth once you get the decoder quest, and it goes a long way towards contextualizing certain story elements as well as broadening one's understanding of the setting as a whole. It also provides a couple story spoilers if you read between the lines, but hey, these things happen, and they are optional. Oh, but speaking of execution, while quite a bit of the story does play out in cutscenes or dialogue, there's also small bits that play out with your partner as you explore, which is a pretty neat detail. Up until you realize that if you're close to any sort of actual cutscene, these'll get cut off to never return again. Other than that though, I'd have to say the narrative journey to the game's climax is a fairly smooth endeavor, but once you're there it can feel a bit abrupt, since by that juncture there are quite a few core questions that are left unanswered, and while there is a stinger, it just serves to add more questions to the pile, and no, there's no true ending to help resolve some of this. But yeah, that's the story bits, so let's get into the gameplay. After all, Anima Flux pitches the premise of a Metroidvania with co-op elements. There's a lot of fun that could be hypothetically had with that kind of concept. Hypothetically, because I'm going to level with you here, if you're going into this with the expectation that's going to introduce some new mechanics on that front, well, no dice. On the exploration side of things, there's just a couple of pressure plate puzzles to fiddle with, and you're more than capable of clearing those on your own by giving orders to the computer-controlled player 2. Which leaves the combat side of things. And sure, while you might think that having the second character controlled by a player would at least make combat revivals a bit easier, No, not really. In fact, I'd actually say it makes the experience harder as a whole, since an AI-controlled player 2 takes tremendously reduced damage, allowing them to stay in the fray long after things have gone to hell. That said, it's not a matter of staying power, really. While there's definitely a degree of utility there for a solo player, there was something else that stuck out to me, that actually led me to changing my mind about roping a friend into this journey, and also led to me rather actively neglecting a part of the game. Which is to say, just about everything to do with playing as the swordsman. because my god is he painful to play as. Picture this, you're a melee character that cannot dodge by default in a game that happily flings swarms of enemies that can and will partially body block and slow you. And no, cutting a path through isn't really an option because your damage sucks by default. Like sure, you do have a brief stun at your disposal, but its cooldown is notable and its range sucks. So odds are, you're just going to be eating damage. A lot of it. Now compare this experience to the archer, who gets a spammy ranged attack that does equivalent if not slightly better damage to the swordsman, given that her ability to just empty arrows at a range and even in the air provides her with a lot of uptime. Doubly so since she also has a nice cooldown ability and it's just an aggressive evasion. It's a simple kit really, but it feels nice to use, especially once I realized she wasn't actually more fragile than the swordsman, at least to any notable degree. Yeah, once I stopped trying to actively use the swordsman, my overall enjoyment of the game just skyrocketed, because bouncing around playing keep away is fun. Sure, I'd occasionally get tagged by a cheap attack due to aggressive AoE spam or getting cornered, but it was a lot more manageable, especially with the CPU becoming a delightfully tanky distraction. So why make things worse by throwing another player into the mix, including for their experience? Like yes, it could be argued that things get better a bit once you get through a third of the friggin' game and finally earn the dash ability and its sweet iframes. Finally, you're able to enjoy a somewhat more counter-offensive playstyle as the swordsman without just eating shovelfuls of shit. But that also entails getting through a third of the game to do what the other player could by default. You know, have fun. And again, you lack all the survivability the CPU has, which loops right back around to things being miserable, since a pair of your later kit unlocks are charge attacks, which heavily benefit from you staying in place. You know, that thing that the guy who needs to sit on an enemy's face really doesn't enjoy doing. Oh, and given that when you combat revive someone, they're only given a sparse amount of health to the point that most bosses and even some enemies will 1 or 2 shot them unless they're CPU controlled. Yeah, as a playing experience, the swordsman just sucks. Like yes, sure, healing items exist, but it's not like he can freely chomp on those to mitigate his failings since you're limited to only being able to carry 1 per character. They don't replenish automatically, and they aren't even all that great until you complete a quest and buy an upgrade for them. Really, if you're dead set on using them, I'd probably wait till the tail end of the game for it, since by that point you'll at least be able to farm all the currency needed to invest in extra damage and armor upgrades, as well as the quests to purchase regenerating armor. Which right, quests, currency. Here's a fun little fact about progression in Anima Flux. You know how in a lot of games you sort of explore the world to collect pickups, to expand your abilities and challenges? Well, this time around, they are relegated strictly to the realm of neat side quests. Except, instead of wandering around to do a bunch of quests, your reward is knowing how much you'll need to grind to unlock your next reward. Yeah, you'll basically find yourself needing to acquire an absolutely filthy amount of currency, since every quest giver you encounter seems to be quite keen on fleecing you for all you're worth and then some. Like, I shit you not, you need to spend money to buy the basic friggin' map. And it sucks, I should add, even when upgraded. So, yeah, just count your blessing that there's no death penalty, because it's already bad enough watching everything you earn slipping away into the pockets of the miserly jackasses you save. I hate them all. I hate them all so much, which was no doubt exacerbated by their love of camping out in remote regions of the city, because, fun fact, there isn't a one-and-done fast travel system. Like, there's a transit system that connects a central hub to a number of key locations, but even with that, and even with my fixation for locking as many shortcuts as I could, I still found myself looping through a number of lengthy heights just to access a quest giver / shop, and then needing to hike my ass right back out of there since there's no quick way to return to the hub either. It's a bit much, honestly. I guess the one high point is you do earn some abilities from just killing bosses, but okay, If I were only to focus on this, I would be doing Anima Flux a disservice, because I did have a fair bit of fun exploring the world once I'd gotten a few movement abilities under my belt. Because sure, a couple of its secrets can be summed up as walk into a transparent wall, but most of the ones I encountered were instead clever combinations of platforming and minor bits of puzzle solving or intuition. And as far as the main path goes, even if there is a certain degree of linearity insofar as the core objective, it still allows for a vast amount of freedom insofar as exploring the world at large, which in and of itself held up pretty well due to the design of the later areas you encounter, since they introduce all sorts of new obstacles and enemies to contend with, providing some proper playgrounds to overcome, as well as an avenue to practice out all sorts of new strategies. And given how much combat irked me early on, I think it says a lot that I found myself being charmed at the tail end of the experience. New enemies and expanding movesets helped. A lot. Alongside some sweet boss fights. Seriously, once you gain the dodge, it all becomes so much more fun to fiddle around with, since by that juncture, every death winds up feeling fair, which, by extension, means that the gradual escalation in complexity was a welcome change. And speaking of change, that's largely my thoughts and mechanics, so let's hop to the visuals. Mostly so I can resume griping about the map. Because, seriously, I really want to emphasize just how much it disappointed me. Sure, I get it, the initial one is default, so it's supposed to suck, but it was a little bit galling after I spent the credits to gain the upgraded one, only to find out it didn't reveal lore points or chests that I discovered, so I had to remember those manually since it didn't let me leave markers. Or highlight resource points. Those would have been nice to have jotted down. Also, quest-related NPCs. Yeah, a bunch of those don't show up either. But since we are talking visuals, at least I can say the overall vibes are quite nice. Whether it's the world design, the characters, the monsters or bosses, all of it looks quite good. That said, the most arresting element to me was the visual style of the animations, which also extends to the character portraits. See, when I was growing up, I watched this really fucking weird show on MTV called Anima Flux. Sort of familiar sounding name there, innit? But what really cinched it for me, what really hit me in the face like the frenzied tail of a trout, was the animations. There's a distinct air of homage that feels hard to miss, and it remains thankfully less disconcerting than its source material. It's weird, but in a good way, and I legitimately found myself looking forward to each new cutscene I'd wind up unlocking just to see what they do visually. So yeah, kudos on that front. And while it's not quite to the same extent, I do still have to give the OST props because it does a great job of providing some moody tracks which overall fit the vibe of the world. Still, while those are certainly highlights, at the end of the day I am trying to gauge Anima Flux as a complete experience, and ultimately, it was a really rough experience, because while I never really hit any real narrative snags, the first third of the game just felt like a slog. One of the characters feels like deadweight, and combat as a whole just feels stiff and unsatisfying. It takes a number of upgrades for things to start becoming fun, and that's a bit of an issue. Again, don't get me wrong, once you get past that point, things do improve markedly, with the ability to evade making the waves of trash mobs a lot more viable to navigate, and allowing for more complex boss encounters, which still ultimately feel fair. And it's nice enough that your kit does expand. I'll admit though that while the charge attacks are technically useful additions to your kit, I only really use them for their exploration utility since they use the same resource as the berserk power you get, which can usually clear out rooms on its own and shred bosses. And as for the exploration, well, okay, like I said earlier, I do think it's a pretty decent experience. At first. Exploring the map and learning the ins and outs and solving puzzles does feel fairly satisfying, but the sheer amount of backtracking really drags the whole thing out, and it really does suck that beyond a few lore points and quest points, the majority of the secrets will boil down to money. Things just wind up getting anticlimactic by the end of it. Yeah, no, I think that really sums up my feelings here. Anima Flux starts out rough and with a fair degree of time and commitment, eventually scales up to become a competent experience, which is a bit of an ask as far as investments go. Now that I've taken time to sit down and think on my experience, my ultimate takeaway is just, it was fine enough, I guess, which is perhaps the most fumblish rating I could give it. But that's as a single player experience. I can't even fathom this being fun when played alongside someone else because of how annoying the early game would be. You know, if you folks even got past the early game. Though I guess upshot, if you do choose to stick it out, you can skip cutscenes, which helps when bosses kill you. Really, the only other note I have to make here, though, is that fans of the original Anima Flux animated series, or who saw the live-action movie, might find themselves predicting major plot beats for Anima's storyline, as well as for the overarching background themes, because there's definitely some overlaps between the two, especially in the overall world-building flavor department. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. Feel free to drop in and say hi. And check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Andy noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.